So I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Christophe Matthijs, who is at the at the Phil in London, doing some very pioneering work on hierarchical computational models of learning. Christophe is trained as a physicist and neuroscientist in Zurich. Thank you very much, Christophe, for presenting today.
Thanks, Michael, for the introduction, and aloha, everyone. I apologize for the boring shirt, but I've only just come here. I haven't had time to stock up on interesting shirts yet. So
I went to buy one yesterday, and they were all made in China. So.
Okay. Yeah, but then, yeah, you went for the T-shirt, so. So maybe, yeah. Let's just get right into the middle of this. I'm going to be speaking about models of behavior and neuroimaging data. And we're going to start out with some fundamental questions. So how do I advance the slides?
Oh, are you PC or Mac?
It's Mac.
So that one?
Or is it?
Yep, and you just press play.
Or is it? Maybe it's this one? No. No, it's this one.
Is it?
Yeah, it's this one, apparently. So, my first question to you is, what do our imaging methods measure? This is not a trick question, and it's as simple as it sounds. What do our imaging methods measure? Anyone? Neurodynamics, I hear? Yeah. We can have it even simpler, just brain activity. This very simple level, we can answer that. So the next question is, when does the brain become active? Always? Yes. But specifically, I mean, there are differences. There are regional differences. There are these modes that we saw, and in response to tasks, we see differences in activities. But when exactly does the brain become active? Sorry? When it gets stimulation. So how does it have to react to stimulation? So the brain is being stimulated. What does it do in response to stimulation? Interaction with the real world, yes. What does it have to do to interact in a way that leads to good outcomes for the brain, for the whole organism? If the organism wants to survive, it has to make good predictions. So the brain becomes active when predictions or the precision of predictions have to be updated. That's when the brain becomes active. And where do the brain's predictions come from? How does the brain come up with predictions? Memory is part of it, yes? Bayes, I hear Bayes. What do you need to do Bayes? Models, yes. The predictions come from a model. So what does this mean for neuroimaging? It means the following. If brain activity reflects model updating, we need to understand what model is updated in what way to make sense of brain activity. So, we have the Bayesian brain, we've already heard that, Bayes, and we have predictive coding. So model-based prediction updating is described by Bayes' theorem. And this leads to the Bayesian brain, to the idea that the brain continually updates predictions about its environment and becomes active, as I said, in order to update predictions or the precision of these predictions. And this goes back to Hermann von Helmholtz, who initiated this theory in the 1860s. And one way this can be implemented is by predictive coding, which is message passing in the brain where predictions and the precision of predictions are passed between different regions in the brain. Now, instead of just recording the activations we have and engaging in what's been called blobology, we can do model-based imaging. And what are the advantages of that? Model-based imaging permits us to infer the computational and that means the predictive mechanism underlying neuronal activity. It permits us to localize such mechanisms, and it allows us to compare different models. So these are three really important advantages of a model-based approach. So how do we build a model of what the brain is doing? We have some fundamental ingredients. One, unsurprisingly, is prediction. So a prediction always goes from X to U. Now, what are X and U? X, oops, going the wrong direction. X is a hidden state of the environment, and U is a sensory input of the agent we're modeling. And, of course, to make predictions about what's going to happen next and what the hidden states of the environment are, our agent has to perform inference based on the prediction errors that arise when it observes sensory input and compares that with its belief on the hidden states. Now, an example of a very simple learning model is the Risk-Korla-Wagner learning model. It doesn't get much simpler than this. So mu is the inferred value of x, and k is a time index. So this is the update from mu at time k minus 1 to mu at time k. And this update takes place by comparing new input with the prediction. So we have the new input u, and we take the difference to the prediction. This gives us a prediction error, which we'll call delta. And this is multiplied by a constant learning rate alpha to give the new prediction mu k. So graphically, we start out with mu at time k minus 1, we make observation u at time k. Delta is our prediction error, and the update moves our belief, our mu k, into the direction of the observed u. And by how much it is moved is determined by the learning rate alpha. So in total, the concept of the agent that we're modeling is this. It's a cycle of sensory input, of a generative process of how the world works. So if the agent acts, that changes the true hidden states of the environment and leads to new sensory input for the agent. And then the agent inverts a perceptual generative model, so its model of how the true hidden states lead to its sensory input, infers these hidden states and acts based on the inference about the hidden states, and then the new cycle of action and perception begins. But how do we get from perception to action? We observe actions in behavioral tasks. And how do we use them to infer beliefs, here denoted by lambda? And that's by inverting a decision model. So we have a model for how the agent translates its beliefs into actions. And I've given you a simple example of a learning model, so I'll also give you a simple example of a decision model. Let's say we have three options, A, B, and C. And these have three values, 8, 4, and 2. And then we can translate these values into action probabilities via a softmax function. And this is this function, where the parameter beta, this is the only parameter in this decision model, determines the sensitivity to value differences. So if we have a low beta of 0.1, then even though A has a value of 8, and B only half that value, and C again half that value, the action probabilities are not that different. And even the action probability for A, action A, is less than half. But if we have a higher beta of 0.6, then the agent is almost certain to perform action A. This is a very simple example of a decision model. So all the necessary ingredients for our model are a perceptual model. That means updates based on prediction errors. We need a value function to get from the inferred state to the action value. And then we need a decision model relating values to action probabilities. An example of a study that did that, I think it was the first model-based imaging study, or at least model-based fMRI study by O'Doherty et al. In 2003, used exactly this learning model, Rescorla-Wagner model, and this decision model that I showed you. And you actually see significant effects of prediction errors with the fixed learning rate in the Rescorla-Wagner model. So the brain is actually interested in these quantities that appear in those models. But we have a Bayesian brain, so we should have Bayesian models for the Bayesian brain. So we can improve on simple learning models like the Rescorla-Wagner model. And in a Bayesian model, you have two main ingredients. That's the likelihood and the prior, and that's proportional to the posterior. That's what makes a Bayesian generative model. And the decisive advantage that this has over a simple heuristic model like the Rescorla-Wagner model is that it includes uncertainty about hidden states. So beliefs don't only have a point estimate, they also have a precision. So how can we make such a thing computationally tractable? Because you saw that the Rescorla-Wagner model was very simple, and there were no computational problems with that. But solving Bayes' theorem is usually computationally intractable because there are integrals involved that have no analytic solution. And you have to work with numerical or analytical approximations. So one way you can do that, or one way we've started doing that, is by employing a model called the hierarchical Gaussian filter. And that has the advantage that it's computationally tractable, and it models individual learning, and it models the uncertainty about all the hidden states of the environment. The main point is that you have a quantity of interest here, x2, that translates into an outcome x1, and the probability of x1 being 1 is a sigmoid function of the value of x2 at each time point, and x2 moves around in time as a Gaussian random walk whose width is determined by the next higher level at x3. So at times when x2 moves fast, when the environment is volatile, x3 will be high, and at times when x2 is stable, x3 will be low. And it turns out you can variationally invert this model and come up with update equations that are simple one-step update equations that pose no computational problems. And the structure of these updates is again the same. It's a learning rate times a prediction error. And the learning rate is a ratio of precisions that determine the learning rate. So we have learning that takes place in the form of updates that are precision-weighted prediction errors. Evidence that the brain actually uses such learning models. This is a simple behavioral model comparison where you see the full HGF winning out against truncated versions of the HGF and older learning models like the Sutton K1 learning model that also has an adaptive learning rate, and Rescorla-Wagner down here. So it quite clearly, with an exceedance probability of 1, wins in a study with 150 participants in total. So behavioral study here had about 50 subjects, fMRI study 1 about 50 subjects, and fMRI study 2 also. So, now, how does the HGF beat the other models? it is by having an adaptive learning rate. But I have to say, it also beats other models that have an adaptive learning rate. And the way the learning rate adapts, you can see here, because this is a simulation of an agent that receives the same inputs at the start of this series and at the end of it. So the first and the last 100 inputs are the same. And in the intervening period, we have higher volatility. So the outcome probability is stable at 0.5 here, then it rises to 0.85, drops to 0.15, and then goes back and forth between these two values before going back to 0.5. And because of this intervening period of higher volatility, you can see the volatility estimate rise and the learning rate adapt to be much higher. So in response to the exact same inputs, the learning rate is much higher here. The updates are much stronger than at the beginning. And this is what you get from modeling the uncertainty about hidden states of the environment. You can then take trajectories of certain quantities in the model and use them as regressors in your imaging analyses. This is an example here, and this is the uncertainty weighted prediction error sigma 2 times delta 1 in the HGF. We're going to call that epsilon 2 in what follows. I'm going to show you some slides of activations in response to epsilon 2. But just remember how abstract this is and how it comes out of a model. So there was a very simple task that we used. There was a cue, a low or a high tone, and then followed by a face or a house, and the associations between low tones and faces changed, and correspondingly those between high tones and houses. So this is the structure of the experiment, and this is the inferred belief of one subject here, the red line. You see very strong activations throughout the brain. This is whole brain corrected in response to this precision-weighted prediction error at the second level. And this is replicated again across two fMRI studies, and this is the conjunction between the two studies. And you even get whole brain corrected activations in the brainstem, that's the red dots here, and replicated again across two studies. And then you even get whole brain corrected activations at the third level of the model in the cholinergic basal forebrain. So this is a strong indication that the brain is actually interested in these quantities contained in such learning models that update beliefs about the environment based on precision-weighted prediction errors. If you want to do modeling like this yourself, you can download the HDF toolbox. It's available at translationalneuromodeling.org. Yeah, that's a typo there. It's translationalneuromodeling.org/tapas. There's an interactive demo and a manual, and if you don't find your favorite model there, you can put it in yourself because it's modular and extensible. It is MATLAB based. Now, I think I'm out of time. But the remaining slides would have just been a very short demonstration of how you can do that in SPM, how you can insert a parametric modulator. But just by looking at the SPM manual, you can find that out yourselves, I'm pretty sure. So, we get to the take-home message. So the main take-home message is actually contained in this graphic. We have an agent, we have its surrounding environment, the world, and there are two interfaces between the agent and the world, sensory input and action. And the agent uses its sensory input to infer on the hidden states of the environment, and based on its beliefs about the hidden states of the environment, it acts. Next take-home message is the brain is an organ whose job is prediction. To make its predictions, it needs a model, and model-based imaging infers the model at work in the brain. It enables inference on mechanisms, the localization of mechanisms, and model comparison. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Now we have left aside some time for questions, and that might include the gentleman who didn't have a chance to ask his question at the end of Peter's talk. So perhaps if you want to ask that question, and Peter can come back here, and other people can silently rehearse their questions in their head while they form a prediction of what it's going to sound like.
So I was curious about the modes, the network modes, and how the temporal behavior of the system relates to the spectral behavior in the network, and if there's a way to relate those two, or if they have to be separable mathematically.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it turns out that since you're asking the mathematical question, that they are separable and in a wide class of models. Not always, so it's not mandatory, but they're most useful if they're separable. And basically each mode has its own frequency and its own damping rate, just like a violin string. And the difference probably in the brain is that the modes are mostly heavily damped. And so only the first few are easy to excite across the whole brain. And again, that's why we see only a few resting state so-called networks, because only the first few modes have very much energy in them.
But is there a way to predict the temporal behavior from
Absolutely.
the current state?
Each one, basically you add these up with their appropriate weights, and each one has a frequency and a damping rate. So if you initialize the brain in a certain way, you'll see each one oscillate and damp away at a known rate. And from that you can get the total signal as a function of time and get an evoked response. Or if you're exciting it randomly, you can get the spontaneous response and its spectrum, and feed that then into measurement theories like how fMRI responds or EEG. Okay. So all of them come out of the activity.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You might as well stay here, Peter.
Thanks for the nice presentations. I was wondering, as was mentioned earlier, the importance of models at different levels. There's also a different level here in computational level. We have a description of what we're trying to compute, and actually what my ideas of the neural mass models and such are kind of like how it's being computed. So how do you see the link between these two?
Christoph, you hazard a guess, and then I'll feel any space left over in the perfect response.
Yeah. So we've now moved on to EEG studies, looking at the quantities in the hierarchies that I'm interested in. And indications are that precision-weighted prediction errors are actually passed from region to region in a temporal sequence that reflects more or less what we see in the hierarchy that we're modeling. And those would be different modes of activity, I think, in the sense that you speak of modes when one level of the hierarchy is dealt with and the next level of the hierarchy is dealt with, and you get to more fine-grained levels. So that would be one way to see that.
Yeah, I think we're pretty much in agreement. There's a lot of time to try and converge these areas, but it's one of the principal things that some of us are working on. So what you see with fMRI, which is what Christoph showed, is basically increases in firing rate in different populations. And what I tried to argue at the end of my talk is that the mean local firing rate is just the first moment. Peter also mentioned this. But if you think of a representation in a part of the brain being that mean firing rate, then the variance around that mean would represent the precision of that representation. I hope that makes sense. And certainly if you use mathematical models or simulations of ensembles of neurons, the more synchronous the neurons are in one region, the stronger their influence on another region. So the means can be the same, but if they're clustered tightly around that mean, they'll exert more influence on another population of spiking neurons. This is quite easy to simulate with models of spiking neurons. And I must admit at the moment the Fokker-Planck, which would be a mean field equivalent of that, is a bit of a cartoon in my thinking. but that would capture that at the population level of description. So, yeah, the good thing is, I think, two good things is we have a map of how to go, but there's a lot of uncertainty in that map, which means that we won't be able to work soon.
Thank you.
Question up the back, and then I'm very pleased with all these questions, so we're fired up now, but I think we have a break. Do we, Stefan, have a break at... but at p:30 we have a break? Okay, Rosalind. So we still have 5 minutes for questions, and then I'm over to Rosalind, but hold on to your questions if you don't get to ask them. Yes, up the back there.
One question I have is that in a number of these talks, people have focused on the incoming stimuli, the incoming situation, the nature of the situation, and yet I don't think that we have a very good model of the situations and how they're changing and what they're about and what the parameters are. They're moving and changing and this and that. So I'm wondering to what extent is the precision that we can get out of our models constrained by our lack of precision in our models of situations and how they change and what's changing in them that people are responding to?
Sorry, do you want to hazard a guess there?
Yeah. So it was mostly due to lack of time that I didn't go into the exact experimental situations that we're modeling. But we're actually modeling quite complex social situations. So one experiment that was done by Andrea Diaconescu involved two people in a situation where one gives the other advice, and there is also a non-social source of information. And these sources of information are associated with a certain level of reliability and also a certain level of precision. And we model all of that in the computational models we have, or we attempt to model that. So I'm not saying that the models that we use are the last word, but we're trying to get there to actually have a picture of the beliefs that are operational at the moment the subject makes his decision.
Yeah.
And in terms of a neural field or mass model, first of all, in the simulations I showed, perturbations would be registered very differently according to whether there was a very well-organised wave or whether there was a transition between waves, in which case the perturbation would have a lot more influence. And the models that we showed also have derivatives, which means they have some momentum, if you like. So what occurs will depend on the sort of state of the model. Is that stepping towards an answer that you're looking for?
I think that it's great that the nature of the stimuli and the situation becomes more complex in terms of how you're working with it. That's terrific. But I guess my comment was a more general one, and coming at this from the vantage point of thinking about situations and that we don't have very good models of how situations differ from one another. And what changes in terms of the underlying parameters for those situations that make them different. And so we don't have a very fine typology at all. We have we have a very impoverished typology of situations and how they're moving and changing. And I'm just wondering to what extent that constrains our overall progress.
I think, well, you highlight some existing gaps in the field, although we could keep trying to provide partial answers. I think the underlying theme is that, computational modelling of neural states and behaviour are both quite new fields. And we recognise that there's a lot to advance upon before we're getting on to models of human agents in rich natural environments. Okay, at the front. I think that's the last question, and then we'll move to Rosalind.
You made a very strong point about that the brain is a prediction machine, and which is, of course, convincing. But I was wondering whether the brain can do anything else than just predictions. Or is everything in the brain about prediction, or is there any theory or alternative explanations why we have a brain?
Well, there's learning. I'll jump in here. Learning, which is part of the model. So learning has to be enacted every time there's a prediction error in proportion to the error. but that's also enslaved to prediction. And even sleep, and I think Stefanus worked on this, these slow things in the prefrontal cortex are also slave to updating predictions about things that unfold on time scale. So I think a lot of other things happen, but they're all in the service not of just prediction, but also, and Carl Friston's not here, but of minimising prediction. Do you have anything to add, Christoph?
I would argue that, in a certain sense, that's all the brain needs to do to get the results it wants. And of course, you can come up with alternative views of how the brain might work, for instance, as a passive information processor. And the thing is that we have convergent evidence from both systems theory, which is more the approach that I presented here, and also empirical evidence from sort of the underlying biology of the brain, that it is most efficient, and it is actually the way the biology of the brain works, that predictions and their precisions are being updated and passed around between different regions in the brain.
But again, predictions is also a concept. It's an abstract thing, and of course, I'm always wondering whether, I'm convinced that this is interesting, but whether we maybe miss something if we only focus on this and then say, okay, this is how the brain works, and this will be how it will be in the next 100 years, and we will never change our view on the brain. So,
well, we need to be able to inform our approach with the errors that we make so that we can update this sort of cosmological view of the brain.
So, and I mean, you have the tool at hand to deal with this, and that's model comparison. So you can come up with a model that doesn't rely on prediction, and then you can take the available data and use model comparison and look which model explains the data better.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you again very much, Christoph.